Canada has been called a mosaic. Different cultures and ethnicities have come together to make this country strong, and Alberta is no different. Most of us are proud of the diversity of the inhabitants of this province. But many of us are not aware that within our own borders, some of our most treasured residents are disappearing right from our own backyards. The province of Alberta has nearly 30 threatened and endangered species. Join us as we introduce you to 7 of them.
Swift foxes are an amazing species. They're unique to North America. They're part of our Canadian heritage. And they're just such an interesting little critter. They're actually about half the size of a red fox. They weigh only 2.5 kilos, but they got their name because they can run at speeds of over 60 kilometers an hour.
Their cousin, the red fox, can be found widespread throughout the northern hemisphere. However, the swift fox is limited to just the western grasslands of North America.
In Canada, we lost them altogether. We lost them by 1938. They were gone from the country, even though at one point, even the Hudson's Bay Company alone had over 100,000 trapping records of them. And every indication is that was a gross underestimation of how many there were truly in this country. Yeah, the interesting thing about the large numbers of furs that were harvested for swift foxes is they were not targeted. Nobody wanted a swift fox fur. They were simply bycatch. I mean, they were just the sort of annoying little things that you would catch at the time that you would try to get a more valuable fur. Another factor that was really crucial in causing a downturn for swift foxes is that as they rely purely on native grassland prairie, a lot of that prairie was plowed for cropland. Generally, we've done extensive studies that show the more native prairies are chopped up through roads or developments or things like that, the less conducive it is to having swift foxes.
Even though they were eradicated from Alberta, there were still populations living south of the border. A seemingly simple solution would be just to relocate them.
The reason why it's such a struggle to reintroduce a species, we're dealing with ecosystems that are not the same as when the species existed there. Those remaining prairies are still very different from what was there before. The grassland ecosystem is different in terms of like the length of grass and the connectivity of different patches, but also the kinds of animals that they compete with or that might prey on them are different than they used to be. The traditional grassland ecosystem had wolves on it, okay? Wolves will kill coyotes, coyotes will kill swift foxes. In that traditional ecosystem, wolves would have kept coyote numbers down, but would not have really bothered much with a little swift fox. With wolves gone, coyote numbers really increased, and coyotes hammer swift foxes. You start to understand how in a relatively simple ecosystem like the prairies, things get complicated in a hurry. When you impact habitat, you need to be careful in terms of taking the considerations of endangered species into account. Swift foxes tolerate fragmentation to some extent, but not excessively. And so we actually study where those thresholds fall. If people have an interest in preserving nature and seeing nature, areas are set aside for protection of the ecosystem, but also for human enjoyment.
The swift fox didn't come back from provincial extinction on its own. Humans were needed to assist the recovery of the species returned to Alberta. If we turn our backs on species that are currently at critical levels, we may not get so lucky in the future.
I think it's inspiring and a symbol of hope, because we lost them in Canada, and yet we've been able to start the process of bringing them back, and that's going well. And I think we can't fail, because it's a beacon of hope in terms of being able to restore past wrongs in general. With the right will and dedication, I know that we can bring species like the swift fox back. So it's there for the taking, and I think we should take it.
Frogs are not something your average Albertan sees on a typical day. That's because there's only 4 species located in the entire province, the largest being the northern leopard frog. The species acts as a good indicator of water quality issues because it's so dependent on water for all of its life stages.
I like to use the expression canary in a coal mine. So because northern leopard frogs obviously utilize water, so if water quality is decreasing, for instance, then northern leopard frog populations would disappear, which would have a big effect on lots of the other animals and plants within that ecosystem or the wetland that they're inhabiting.
Since the 70s and 80s, there's been a decline in this species. Experts cannot pinpoint a single reason for the decline, but suggest a combination of reasons. One of those reasons is predation, not just of the frog, but of their young as well. You would think that a species that lays 4,000 to 5,000 eggs would beat the odds of survival.
But they play a numbers game. So there's lots of animals that predate on frogs, including eggs. Some of that would be invasive fish species, also lots of birds. So they're kind of relatively at the bottom of the food chain. So lots of things want to eat you. So it's good to play a numbers game.
One of its major predators is the northern pike, a species introduced to supply the demand of recreational fishing.
Moving and shifting species like pike around into areas where they didn't formerly belong is like, will have huge impacts.
Another major challenge for the northern leopard frog is the drainage of Alberta's wetlands.
And if there's been significant wetland drainage throughout the province to the point where they lay their 4,000 or 5,000 eggs per female on one site, but none of those juveniles are ever going to be able to disperse and repopulate another waterway because there's no water adjacent to them, then those populations of frogs that still exist cannot repopulate other waterways. It's an issue of waterways throughout the province. You've lost them from so many of those sites, just completely, that now they're only at a small number of sites.
Imagine you and 20 of your family are crammed into a small house. It's time for some of the kids to move into their own home. But the nearest home is miles and miles away, and there's no mode of transportation to get you there. Lack of connectivity and wetland drainage. This is the uphill battle the northern leopard frog faces.
The farther away they are, you can imagine a little tiny frog having to jump 20 kilometers and crossing 3 main highways isn't going to be that successful in getting to the other pond.
I think it's very promising if we act now, because you've still got them. I've spent 15 years of my life working in endangered species, conservation and research. And when you work on a lot of other projects where species have got critically endangered, you often think, what if I could go back 100 or 50 years to when we knew they were in trouble, but they weren't in so much trouble, as they are now. And so the northern leopard frog is kind of in that situation because we're noticing the decline. And so we have a source population that we can manage that's still in reasonably good numbers. So if we act now, then we really can save them in Alberta. In Canada, you don't have an incredible diversity of amphibians, and to lose them will deny the future generations of Alberta the amphibian experience, which is a part of the wilderness experience.
Its scientific name is Ursa arctos horribilis, horrible bear. At a maximum of 1,000 pounds and 9 feet tall, the grizzly is a formidable and imposing predator.
Perhaps the biggest myth is that they are fearsome killers, exaggerating the danger of any single encounter with them. I've spent in excess of 5,000 hours on foot in the field working with grizzly bears. And people who haven't spent time around grizzly bears tend to exaggerate the danger because occasionally they do seriously injure people. But so do automobiles, so do helicopters, so do all sorts of things. But because I think the grizzly bear is an animal and such a large and massive animal, the focus on the danger gets blown out of all proportion to the reality. That is the biggest myth about grizzly bears.
We've all heard stories about people and bear encounters, and chances are if you've made a day trip into K country, there's always the possibility that you'll see one yourself. But most encounters are with Alberta's smaller black bear, and not the larger and rare grizzly.
Generally speaking, there's about 50 times as many black bears in Alberta as there are grizzly bears. The grizzly bear's range in Alberta has been reduced dramatically in the last 150 years. 150 years ago, there were perhaps at least 6,000 grizzly bears in Alberta. The most recent count is around 750.
Today, grizzlies have been pushed into isolated pockets, but that wasn't always the case.
At one time, grizzly bears ranged widely throughout most of the province of Alberta, including on the prairies. There was a thousands and thousands of year-long relationship between bison and grizzly bears. And bison provided some of the highest quality food that a bear could ever dream of having. At one time, grizzly bears were, I wouldn't say common on the prairie, but you could see a fair number. And evidence to that was around 1880, Isaac Cowie, who was a trader for the Hudson Bay Company, recorded a half kill of grizzly bears being traded. That half kill was 750 grizzly bears right from the Cypress Hills in Alberta. So there were a lot of bears out there, and as humans have moved into the landscape, there's been less and less space and less opportunity for grizzly bears to survive.
Pressure on the grizzly bear started 350 years ago and has not let up since.
That's because grizzly bears die for all sorts of diverse reasons, but they seldom die natural deaths unless they're very, very young. There's just a plethora of ways that a grizzly bear can get into trouble. Recently, we've had a special problem with grizzly bear mortality on the railway tracks in Banff National Park. And grizzly bears, for one reason or another, either being attracted to the tracks for a long while, grain was a major attractant. Supposedly now there's real efforts being made to improve this situation. It's taken a long time to respond to this, what is now the #1 source of grizzly bear mortality in Banff National Park, collisions with railways. But the CPR seems to be headed in the right direction. They've committed significant funds toward research, and they've committed significant effort toward trying to make the grain cars not leak. So it's a big problem, and finally we have hope that there's going to be some serious efforts made in addressing it.
Alberta is rich in energy resources and relies heavily on the jobs it creates. Oil and gas is a fact of life in this province.
The challenge is not the extraction of the oil and gas from the wellhead, but however much traffic goes into exploration, maintenance of wellhead sites, road systems, because if there is a single predictor of how well grizzly bears do, it's the amount of human activity in the area.
Among land use issues between humans and grizzlies, ranching is another that has deep impact on the species. On rare occasions, a grizzly can develop the bad habit of preying on livestock. Such animals have to be put down.
But ranching also contributes tremendously to the conservation of grizzly bears because it keeps private lands in fairly extensive as opposed to intensive use. And of course, grizzly bears have a much better chance with an environmentally conscientious rancher than they do with a housing development. Human recreation is yet another challenge that grizzly bears face. Hiking itself is certainly not totally benign. As it reaches higher use levels, it starts to displace grizzly bears from areas where they're finding resources, and yet they're reluctant to take on the numbers of the presence of larger numbers of people.
The single biggest threat for most species is the inability to connect with other populations. The same holds true for grizzly bears.
So we do have to worry about connectivity of populations because that's what maintains genetic diversity, and even more important, when a given population unit starts to decline in size, it can be rehabilitated by the input of individuals from other populations. but those populations have to be connected. So we have a couple of issues. One are the number of bears, and then the connectivity of the larger population in order to address both genetic and population decline issues. It's not so much disease that you get in small and isolated populations, but a phenomena that biologists call genetic drift, where you can get the accumulation of deleterious, of bad genes, literally. It's just like human beings interbreeding. We don't marry first cousins and have offspring. The same thing happens in small populations of grizzly bears. And this is why larger connected populations are so effective for conservation of species.
The grizzly's many external challenges are compounded by a biological one.
They have one of the lowest reproductive rates of any species in North America. We found in our study of reproductive rates in Banff National Park that the grizzly bears weren't reproducing till they were almost 5 years old. And then they weren't successfully reproducing typically until they were about 8 years old. And then they were having 4.5 years in between litters. So if you kill too many grizzly bears, they're not like deer or rabbits or coyotes. They don't bounce right back. They are slow to recover their population numbers. So biologically, we have some challenges in maintaining grizzly bear populations.
Sadly, there are many Albertans who don't want to save the grizzly. They don't see its value.
But the bear is part of an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is part of the core of Alberta. That's the greatest contribution that grizzly bears have to make, is to connect us with some of the wildest nature we have in Alberta. The issue of whether it's good enough just to have grizzly bears in national parks, we probably don't have large enough national parks with grizzly bear populations in Alberta to maintain the species for the long-term time frame. The ethical question is, do we have the right to remove grizzly bears from everywhere we want? Do we want Alberta outside of national parks to be declared a grizzly bear free zone? And this is what happened. This is what happened in California. In the United States, the grizzly bear has about 2% of its former range. And we may be on a path toward doing that in Alberta. We need to develop Alberta for sure, no question. But we need to do it in a manner that leaves behind some of the fabric that was here when our forefathers arrived.
There is only one lizard native to our province. It is the tiny spotted shorthorn lizard. They exist in southeastern Alberta, ranging from north of Medicine Hat to the US border, with the highest concentration around the town of Manyberries.
They're really distributed really patchy throughout Alberta. So as a person that's been out in the field for the past 2 summers, oftentimes we walk and we walk and we walk and we don't see anything. Overall, they're just really hard to find. They're camouflaged too. So if you're not paying attention to what's going on the ground, if you're like looking at the birds instead of looking at the ground, you could really easily miss them.
Population estimates vary from 5,000 to 12,000 individuals, but due to habitat fragmentation, that number is on the decline. Like other threatened species, habitat fragmentation is its biggest challenge. For example, if you were to find a handful of the tiny lizards on a hill, you would most likely have to travel 15 kilometers or more just to find the nearest population.
Well, they're threatened because of habitat disturbance. So a lot of their existing habitat in Alberta has been disrupted because of human influences. So we have oil and gas drilling, irrigation, the roads that kind of cut right through the coulees where they live. All those play a big factor in fragmenting populations. Further south along the Milk River, there are some sites where we have gone to visit them. and we can't find any horned lizards. Or we find 5 horned lizards, and a researcher 30 years ago found 200 horned lizards. So there's obviously a problem with population fluctuations, and I guess ideally you want to have enough individuals in Alberta to have good breeding going on with the lizards, and there's not a lot of inbreeding going on with them. The shorthorn lizard is a part of a bigger food chain. If you're wiping off a species at risk, you're affecting another species at risk higher up in the food chain, so that poses a problem as well.
It's easy to be dismissive of a species so small and one many of us have never seen, but we have a real opportunity to try and help save Alberta's only native lizard species. Rethinking agricultural practices, conscious road planning, continued research and education will all factor into bringing this species back from the brink. It's easy to be apathetic to the plight of woodland caribou. Many of us have seen nature videos that depict caribou by the thousands, but not all caribou species are created equal.
If there's so many caribou wandering around up in the northern tundra, why worry about woodland caribou? They are genetically distinct animals, and the woodland caribou itself, because of its attachment to boreal forest, is, in my mind, the ambassador for boreal forest. And that band of boreal forest that stretches across our entire country, in fact, all the way around the world, is one of the most important carbon sinks we have on the planet. And the intact boreal forest, the largest chunk of it, is in Canada. And I think Canadians have an obligation as stewards of that resource to protect the boreal forest. And so, if you protect caribou and you protect woodland caribou habitat, you are, by definition, protecting boreal forest. So I think they're an incredibly important ambassador species for that ecosystem. Well, currently the status of woodland caribou in Alberta is threatened. There was a time back in the late 80s when they were actually listed as endangered. There has been a historical population in Banff National Park. And not very long ago, I was at Chateau Lake Louise and I saw caribou trophies on the wall. So there were some very large and healthy caribou living in Banff National Park for most of its history. But in 2009, the last remnant herd of Banff caribou was wiped out by an avalanche. So they've now been extirpated from that national park, which is a shame because it's an iconic species. It's probably in all of our pockets if we're carrying around a quarter. It is the animal on the back of the quarter. Some people think it's an elk, but it's actually a caribou. And it was inspired by caribou in places like Banff National Park. So those animals are now gone.
The biggest threat facing the woodland caribou in Canada's boreal forests is what experts call linear disturbance.
And so with anything that creates a cut into an old-growth forest, creates access for predators. And so roads, industrial operations, forestry operations, oil and gas operations, things of that nature, seismic lines. These kinds of things open up a forest to wolves, essentially. And so when wolves get onto these access points, they can get right into the middle of woodland caribou range. And when they get there, they find that woodland caribou are pretty easy pickings. And so they overhunt the caribou and the populations start to decline. And the two sources of linear disturbance currently are forestry and oil and gas. Oil and gas guys, I talk with them all the time about caribou. They're concerned about caribou too, because when they're not at work, they're just like me. They worry about nature. They worry about endangered species, and they don't want to be the guys who push them to extinction. So they're trying to do their part as well. Sometimes regulation can be changed to benefit something like caribou. Like it's interesting that an oil and gas operation might create a linear disturbance. And in order to, if the oil and gas operation wants to go back into a site, say a drilling site, and reuse it 20 years later, they want to maintain the lease. But in order to maintain their control of the land, they can't recover and rehabilitate the lease. So they can't replant the road, take the road out and let the lease grow back in and put the habitat back the way it was. Because there's potentially they could lose their rights to the land. And so if we could all get together at the table, the regulation, the government regulators, the industry people, and the scientific community, I bet we could come up with a solution for caribou.
Although we benefit from these industries, we're quick to vilify both forestry and oil and gas. Issues regarding woodland caribou seem remote and distant from our day-to-day lives.
If they're anything like me, it's a lot of these issues are out of sight and out of mind. Like caribou are a species that exist up north. They live in the boreal forest. That doesn't have that much of a day-to-day impact on my life here in Calgary in an urban setting like this, and yet it does. What happens to caribou has a big impact on us, and the caribou numbers and how we protect them will have an impact on forestry and oil and gas development. And so there has to be a way to let industrial development proceed, because we all need that sort of thing in our lives, but there also has to be a way of protecting caribou, because we all depend on the ecosystem services that the forest and the caribou and so on provide.
There are many instances in which humans have destroyed or negatively altered an environment. In most cases, the damage is irreversible.
But many people believe, and I believe, that linear disturbance can happen and then be reversed. Things can be rehabilitated. So I think that it just depends on maybe how long the linear disturbance exists on the landscape. I think there's work to be done with possibly controlling wolf populations in places where they're hammering caribou. So there's maybe some benefit that can happen there to caribou populations. I think there's some solutions. I don't believe that we have to put a moratorium on all industrial development in order to protect caribou. I think that some landscape needs to be protected, that those protected areas need to have connectivity to other protected areas so that animals can move back and forth. But I don't think we need to take the whole map and the whole boreal forest and say that's for caribou. I'm not sure that's practical, and it might be a little naive and probably not even possible. So I think we should be thinking about protected areas and connectivity and mitigating the damage that we do. And the guys I talk to in industry seem to be willing to do that. So I think there's hope for caribou. That's the short story.
Unlike most owls, the burrowing owl makes its home underground, readily makes appearances during the day, and is not dependent on trees or other elevated perches.
They are a prairie species, so in native grassland prairies is where you're most likely to see them. They used to be much wider distributed in Canada, but their population now has shrunk to only about 35% of their historic range, and even within that area, it's quite spotty. Burrowing owls are one of the smaller raptors or birds of prey out on the prairie, so they are predated on by a whole range of bigger raptors. So basically, any bigger hawk will eat them. They're also challenged because they live in the ground, they're then challenged by coyotes and animals that will access their burrows in the ground as well, that can dig at them. So they have the challenge of land predators and air predators as well. So they have a lot of challenges on the predation side. And if they're threatened, they're very well adapted to the prairie ecosystem. They know who the fiercest people in the prairies are, and they'll make a rattling sound just like a rattlesnake down in their burrow. And let me tell you, I've had some jump backs from nests. Even though I know they make the rattling sound, I've gone up to burrows to do some of our research, and as they start to approach it, you hear this rattle, and it doesn't matter how many times you've heard it, you jump back every time. Like so many other species that have declined, it's really a mixture of several factors. Certainly habitat loss and degradation has been huge, and their decline is really symptomatic of a bigger problem in the grasslands ecosystem across North America. Only about 2% of the grasslands across North America is protected, so they're one of the most endangered ecosystems in North America, and we don't tend to think of them in that way. Largely, it's been loss of their nest sites, because they can't dig their own burrows, so they rely on other mammals like badgers and prairie dogs to dig the burrows for them, but those animals have been really persecuted. So they've disappeared from a lot of their area as well, so the owls have also lost their nest sites. And the challenge is they're migratory species. So some of them spend their winters down in Texas and Mexico, but then they're up here in Canada for their summers. So we need to be working across that whole landscape to try and ensure their future. So it's not just what we do in Canada. Their decline is affected by everything along that way as well. Struggling because it's a continental issue. It's not something that we can there's no easy fix that we can just apply in our own backyard here and then the problem is solved. It's a problem that we have to be addressing in Canada, US, and Mexico. And that is a big issue to try and address over that area. And there's all sorts of social and economic and political considerations to bring in.
Assisting the burrowing owl requires data, and acquiring the data is a big challenge.
The challenge has been burrowing owls are quite small. So they're only about the size of a pop can and weigh about half of what a pop can weighs. So they're a very small animal, and a lot of the technology that we currently have for tracking them is too big to put on them. So you can put radio transmitters on, and there has been some good research done on the prairie populations to put radio transmitters on to see where they go. Right now we have, we know where they are in the summer, we have a few dots as to where they are in the winter, but we have no idea what happens in between. And a lot of that ecosystem along that migration route has been destroyed. So they don't have the escape holes and the burrows along routes. They don't have the same food sources that they would have historically had. In Alberta, some of the breeding pair numbers are around 50. Fluctuates again each year depending on how many return birds we have coming back from migration.
The status of the burrowing owl has gone from at risk to threatened to the critical level of endangered. It is a fragile species living in a disappearing environment.
They're a symbol of the health of the prairie system because they're one of if you lose burrowing owls, it's a sign that you've lost a whole bunch of species underneath them. You've lost the keystone species such as prairie dogs that are holding up the prairie ecosystem. So they're really an icon for a healthy prairie ecosystem. And it's also, I think there's a bigger responsibility as humans. We've altered the landscape, we've created factors that have caused their decline. And it's really our responsibility to fix those problems and to understand what we've done and how to go about fixing those problems.
Many species were impacted by the arrival of European settlers. The plains buffalo was eradicated, the gray wolf was decimated, and the whooping crane was exterminated. They were down to 16 known individuals in the entire world.
It's thought that as white European settlers settled North America, they changed the habitat, drained wetland areas, changed natural areas over to fields for agriculture because the birds can usually only lay 2 eggs and rear 1 chick a year. They couldn't recover from things like that. They were disturbed by people. They kept being pushed away from human settlement.
Once found widespread across the Great Plains, the whooping crane's breeding grounds were shrunk down to what is now called Wood Buffalo National Park.
So what almost wiped out the whooping cranes, a lot of wetland drainage is likely to have caused their decline, but also, unbelievably, they were hunted and shot. So hunters back in those days just used to shoot everything. It's probably a combination of habitat loss and hunting pressure that would have endangered them.
The crane has been protected for decades, but it's still considered a threatened species, and it remains on the long road to recovery.
Whooping cranes are not a very adaptable or flexible species, and so they're very tied to their wetland habitat. If they don't have good quality wetlands to feed in, to live in, to nest in, they just don't do very well.
Because of the crane's slow rate of reproduction, breeding programs were established and the use of innovative tools were developed.
What I've got in my hand and what it is used for is this is what we call an archive egg. It's basically a data logger, the same size of a whooping crane egg. We can put this with the birds, they accept it as a real egg, and we can learn about how the whooping cranes are incubating their eggs. The main purpose of this tool is captive managers who are trying to breed endangered species to release back into the wild can try to optimise egg production by taking the first clutch and making them lay more eggs. But you need to ensure the eggs you've taken hatch, otherwise it's not worthwhile.
But success at their breeding grounds at Wood Buffalo is not enough. Each year, the birds have to migrate up to 4,000 kilometers south to Texas. It's critical for there to be rest over wetlands along the way.
I've found that we've actually had an amazing and cooperative collaboration with the US government and the International Crane Foundation, which is a non-profit group. I think, like us, they're an enthusiastic and passionate group and want to jump through hurdles and bureaucracy in order to do the best for the cranes.
A major contributor to the ongoing efforts of protecting the whooping crane is the Calgary Zoo. The Devonian Wildlife Conservation Center is an off-site facility of the zoo that has breeding programs for endangered species like the whooping crane.
I say that and I think it's really important that the Calgary Zoo plays a big role because this is an Albertan story. The only remaining population survived. It's at breeding grounds. It migrates to Aransas, Texas for it to overwinter, but its breeding grounds are in Alberta and Wood Buffalo National Park. The Calgary Zoo is the only institution in Canada that captively breeds whooping cranes for reintroduction into the wild. Since about, I believe, 1990, the Calgary Zoo has been providing breeding chicks and fledglings, young birds that are taken down to the US programs and released there as part of their programs. So over almost 15 to 20 years, the zoo has been providing birds to supplement the wild populations and to bolster the wild populations. We have a very passionate group that work on this in an off-site facility. So yeah, it's a big effort from the Calgary Zoo.
The Devonian Wildlife Conservation Center was established in 1984, just southeast of Calgary.
Right now we have a total of about 6 or 7 breeding pairs right now, and that are laying eggs, and we have a total of about 20 whooping cranes here right now. We do some artificial insemination with the birds to get more fertile eggs from the flock than we would otherwise.
While the crane has come a long way, its future is not guaranteed.
I think it's good if we keep making the progress we're making and improving on it, and assuming that their habitat can stay intact. I think they're not there yet, but they are a conservation success story. They've come from the brink to quite a considerable way back to being secured. They're not secure yet, but as long as North Americans are committed to preserving their habitat, then sure, their future can be secured.
It's known as the Calgary Zoo, but it's more than just a zoo. It's dedicated to environmental education, wildlife research, and the preservation of endangered species.
The Calgary Zoo, we do so much more than just exhibit animals here at this site. In fact, at the Center for Conservation Research here at the Calgary Zoo, we specialize in doing science that is helpful to help species and ecosystems beyond the borders of this zoo. We think we have a critical role to play as a conservation organization, not just in terms of interacting with the visitor here, but really in terms of coming up with innovative scientific solutions to difficult problems to ensure that wild places and wild species are here to stay. No one organization is going to save a species, and it's not just us. However, we have been involved and I think played a pivotal role in the reintroduction of swift foxes, whooping cranes, Vancouver Island marmots, burrowing owl, the northern leopard frog, and the black-footed ferret. The Calgary Zoo is a non-profit organization, and even for our own research efforts here, we're funded over 80% externally. When visitors come to the zoo, a portion of their admission, if you will, comes to support the kinds of efforts that we do. So it's crucial, I think, in terms of how you choose your entertainment dollars. It's a little bit different than going to the movie theater, which is fun and I love it. But when you come to the Calgary Zoo, you're actually doing slightly more than that. You're doing something with your admission to also help the conservation of species and ecosystems.
All of our experts agree that Alberta needs to progress, but not at the expense of our Indigenous wildlife. Each of us has a responsibility and a role to play. To find out more about all of the species at risk, visit srd.alberta.ca.